It's a Tuesday morning in Sheffield city centre. You're standing on Fargate, the pedestrian street that runs through the heart of the city. Around you, coffee shops, a Marks and Spencer, students from 2 universities heading somewhere with purpose. Trams slide past on the tracks below. The hills are visible in every direction. Sheffield sits in a bowl of green hills, the Peak District beginning almost at the city's edge, and the hills remind you constantly that this place was chosen for reasons that have nothing to do with human convenience. The reasons are water. 5 rivers running down from the hills: the Don, the Sheaf, the Riverlin, the Loxley, the Porter. Fast rivers, cold rivers. Rivers with enough force, running over enough stone to power a wheel. Sheffield was built on water power before it was built on coal. Before the steam engines, before the furnaces, before the smoke that would one day make this city's skyline the most recognizable industrial silhouette in England, there were the wheels. Grinding wheels. The sound of Sheffield is the sound of metal on stone. That sound is mostly gone now, but the city it created is still here, still working out what it is without it. Using AI to reconstruct historical photographs and engravings, we are going to walk Sheffield from its earliest beginnings to the city it is today. We will follow the first cutlers grinding blades in the river valleys. We will go down into the grinding hulls, the workshops built along the riverbanks, and understand what it cost to work there, what it cost in years of life and lungs full of steel dust. We will stand outside the gates of the great steelworks in 1984 and watch the world change in real time. We will meet the people this city produced, the scientists, the politicians, the artists, and understand what Sheffield gave to the world beyond cutlery and steel. And we will try to understand what a city does when the thing it was built to do is finished. This is the complete story of Sheffield. Let's begin. It is the year 1000 AD approximately, where the River Sheaf meets the River Don. In a valley between wooded hills, a small settlement exists. The name Sheffield comes from this meeting of waters, Sheaf Field, the open land by the River Sheaf. The Romans passed through the area, building a fort at Templeborough, a few miles northeast, on the Don. But Roman Sheffield is peripheral, a staging post, not a settlement of consequence. What matters here comes later. The Domesday Book of 1086 records Sheffield as a small manor. 7 households, a church, some woodland, a mill. Population, perhaps 60 or 70 people. It is among the least remarkable places in Yorkshire. The surrounding hills are forested. The rivers run clear and cold. The stone is millstone grit, hard, resistant, grey-brown, the stone that the whole character of this region is eventually carved from. What Sheffield has, in 1086, is iron ore in the hills and water in the valleys. Neither matters yet. The Norman Lord William de Loveto builds a castle at the confluence of the Sheaf and the Don in the early 12th century. It is not a grand castle, timber initially, then stone, controlling the river crossing and the road north. Around the castle, a small town begins to form. A market is established. The Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, later Sheffield Cathedral, is founded. By 1200, the town has perhaps 500 people. The iron ore in the hills begins to matter. Smiths come to Sheffield. The combination of iron in the ground, fast water for power, and wood for charcoal makes the valley ideal for metalworking. By the 13th century, Sheffield cutlers, makers of knives, scissors, shears, are establishing themselves in the town and in the river valleys to the west. The word cutler comes from the Latin cultellarius, knife maker. Sheffield's cutlers will eventually become the most famous craftspeople in the world in their trade, and the trade will define the city for 7 centuries. The craft is precise, demanding, and dangerous. A knife requires multiple stages: forging the blade from iron, grinding it to a sharp edge, polishing it, fitting a handle of bone or wood or horn. Each stage is a separate skill, often practiced by different craftspeople. Sheffield develops, earlier than almost anywhere else in England, a proto-industrial division of labour. Not a factory, not yet, but a network of specialists, each doing one stage of the process, passing the work on. The grinding is done at wheels powered by the rivers. Grinding hulls, long, low buildings straddling the watercourses, line the Don and the Sheaf and the Riverlin. Inside, the grinders sit hunched over spinning sandstone wheels, holding blades against the stone, the sparks flying, the air thick with stone dust and metal particles. The grinders live shorter lives than almost any other working people in England. The dust enters their lungs and does not leave. Grinders' asthma, it is called, a progressive destruction of the lung tissue that leaves men breathless in their 30s, dead in their 40s. The average age at death of a Sheffield grinder in 1840 is 28 years. Fork grinders, working with the finest grit, die even younger. The finest grinders, making the most delicate blades, tend to be dead by their mid-30s. They know this. Every grinder who sits down to his wheel in 1750 knows that the work is killing him. They do it anyway because it is what Sheffield does, and what Sheffield does is what puts food on the table. This is not resignation, it is not stupidity. It is the particular calculation that working people throughout history have made when the alternative to dangerous work is no work at all. Geoffrey Chaucer mentions a Sheffield knife in the Canterbury Tales, written in the 1380s. The miller, one of Chaucer's pilgrims, carries a Sheffield whittle, a Sheffield blade, in his stocking. This is the earliest recorded literary mention of Sheffield's trade. By the 14th century, Sheffield steel is known across England. By the 16th, it is known across Europe. Mary Queen of Scots is imprisoned at Sheffield Castle and Sheffield Manor for 14 years, from 1570 to 1584, in the custody of the Earl of Shrewsbury. She is not unhappy here, relatively speaking. She hunts in the park, she embroiders, she plots. Sheffield is a backwater, far from the courts of Europe, and that is exactly why Elizabeth I's government sends her there. The presence of the Scottish Queen adds a faint glamour to the town's history that Sheffield has never quite known what to do with. She is executed at Fotheringhay in 1587. The castle that held her is demolished during the Civil War in the 1640s. Almost nothing remains. The 17th century brings two things that will transform Sheffield beyond recognition. The first is Benjamin Huntsman. Huntsman is born in Lincolnshire in 1704. He is a clockmaker by trade, dissatisfied with the quality of the steel available for his clock springs. He comes to Sheffield in 1742 and begins experimenting in a small furnace at Handsworth, then a village east of the town. After years of trials, he perfects a process for making crucible steel, steel of a purity and consistency that no one has achieved before. He melts Swedish iron in a sealed clay crucible at extraordinary temperatures, using coke rather than charcoal. The result is a steel so uniform, so hard, so reliable that it makes every previous steel look crude. Huntsman wants to sell his crucible steel to Sheffield's cutlers. The Sheffield cutlers, conservative and suspicious, initially refuse. They say it is too hard to work. They continue buying inferior imported steel. Huntsman sells his crucible steel to the French instead. The Sheffield cutlers, watching French manufacturers use Huntsman's steel to produce blades that are visibly superior to their own, eventually capitulate. By the end of the 18th century, Sheffield crucible steel is the finest in the world, and it is in Sheffield's cutlery and in Sheffield's tools that the Industrial Revolution is literally being cut and shaped. The second transformation is coal. The coal fields that underlie the eastern half of Sheffield's hinterland begin to be seriously exploited in the 18th century. Coal replaces wood and charcoal as fuel. Steam engines replace water wheels, or more accurately, supplement them, because the water wheels continue working long after steam arrives. The combination of crucible steel technology and cheap coal energy makes Sheffield into something it has never been before: an industrial city. The population explodes. In 1700, perhaps 3,000 people live in Sheffield. By 1800, 45,000. By 1850, 135,000. By 1900, 380,000. People pour in from the English countryside, from Ireland, from Wales. They come for the work. The work is in the grinding hulls and the forges and the new rolling mills, and increasingly in the great steelworks that begin to appear in the Don Valley east of the town centre. The Don Valley, this is where the real story of industrial Sheffield happens. The valley floor along the River Don, stretching east from the town centre toward Rotherham, becomes over the course of the 19th century one of the most extraordinary concentrations of heavy industry anywhere on Earth. steel furnaces, rolling mills, forges the size of cathedrals, cranes that can lift objects weighing hundreds of tons. The sky above the Don Valley is permanently orange at night from the glow of the furnaces. The noise is continuous, the hammers, the rollers, the hiss of steam, the roar of molten metal being poured. Sheffield steel becomes the steel of the modern world. Not just the cutlery trade, though that continues. The armaments industry. Sheffield makes the steel for naval guns, for cannon, for armor plate. It makes the steel for railway lines, and the railways are being built everywhere, across Britain, across America, across the world. Sheffield makes the steel for bridges. It makes the steel for buildings. The Eiffel Tower contains Sheffield steel. The cables of the Brooklyn Bridge contain Sheffield steel. The Royal Navy's dreadnoughts are armored with Sheffield steel. The names of the great Sheffield steel firms become known worldwide. Browns, later John Brown and Company, Camels, Vickers, Hadfields, Firths. These are not merely local businesses. They are global arms and engineering companies whose products determine the outcomes of wars and the shape of cities on every continent. Thomas Bolsover is a Sheffield cutlersman who in 1743 accidentally discovers that silver and copper, fused together under heat, can be worked as if they are a single metal. He creates Sheffield plate, silver-coated copper, far cheaper than solid silver, affordable by the rising middle class that the Industrial Revolution is creating. Sheffield plate transforms the domestic goods industry across Europe. Every middle-class household in Victorian England fills its sideboard with Sheffield plate candlesticks, coffee pots, toast racks. Bolsover, characteristically, makes very little money from his discovery. Other men are better at commerce than he is. Then, in 1856, something happens in a small furnace in London that will change Sheffield and the world in ways that take a generation to fully understand. Henry Bessemer is not from Sheffield. He is an inventor and entrepreneur from Hertfordshire. But what he invents in 1856, a process for converting molten pig iron into steel by blasting air through it, burning off the carbon impurities in a spectacular shower of sparks, taking minutes rather than hours, is a revolution in steelmaking. The Bessemer converter produces steel in quantities and at speeds that make crucible steel look artisanal. Sheffield, initially resistant, the crucible steel masters see the Bessemer process as a threat to their craft, eventually adopts it, and in doing so becomes the steel capital of the world on an entirely new scale. Walk the Don Valley in 1880 and you are walking through the most productive stretch of land in the history of human industry. The furnaces run 24 hours a day. The rolling mills produce rail sections that are shipped to America, to India, to Australia. The armor plate works produce steel for battleships. The forges produce crankshafts for ocean-going steamships. And the people who make all of this live in the streets behind the furnaces. The working-class housing of Victorian Sheffield is not the worst in England. It is better than the back-to-back slums of Leeds, marginally better than the cellars of Liverpool. But it is grim. Terraced streets of back-to-back houses running up the steep hillsides around the valley. 2 rooms, front and back, shared between families of 6, 7, 8 people. No indoor plumbing. Communal privies in the yards, the air permanently thick with smoke and grit from the steelworks. On bad days, the soot is visible on people's faces within an hour of washing. Sheffield in the 19th century is among the most polluted cities in Europe. The rivers run black with industrial effluent. The Don at Sheffield is, by 1870, essentially dead. No fish, no plant life, an open sewer for the steelworks. The children work. This is the part of Sheffield's history that the city's proud industrial narrative tends to skim past. Children as young as 7 and 8 are employed in the grinding hulls and the buffer shops and the smaller cutlery workshops. The buffer girls, women and girls who polish the finished cutlery on leather wheels charged with rouge, work in clouds of metal dust that damage their lungs almost as badly as the grinders' wheels damage the men's. Parliamentary inquiries into child labour in Sheffield in the 1860s and 1870s produce testimony that is almost unbearable to read. Children describing working 12-hour days. Children describing accidents with machinery. Children describing the coughs that begin in their teenage years and do not stop. Samuel Plimsoll is born in Bristol but spends his formative years in Sheffield, working as a clerk in a brewery in the 1840s. He sees in Sheffield's industrial workforce the same exploitation that he will later observe in the merchant navy, workers treated as expendable instruments of profit, with no protection and no recourse. He goes on to become one of the great Victorian reformers, campaigning for the Plimsoll line, the load line marked on every ship's hull, above which it must not be loaded, a regulation that saves an incalculable number of sailors' lives. His Sheffield years shape him. The exploitation he witnesses in the grinding hulls and the buffer shops is the same exploitation he sees in the overloaded ships, and he fights both with the same furious energy. The First World War transforms Sheffield's steelworks into the largest armaments complex in the British Empire. John Brown's works, Vickers, Hadfield's, they produce shells, gun barrels, armor plate, naval artillery in quantities that were previously unimaginable. The Sheffield steelworks operate without stopping for 4 years. The men who would normally work them are at the front. Nearly 100,000 Sheffield men enlist, of whom more than 5,000 are killed. The women who take over the factory floors, the munitionettes, do work that no woman in Sheffield had formerly done before, operating heavy machinery, filling shells, managing the furnaces. They do it brilliantly and are sent home when the men return. The Second World War brings the Sheffield Blitz. On the nights of the 12th and 15th of December 1940, the Luftwaffe attacks the city specifically because of its steel and armaments production. 660 people are killed. Thousands of homes are destroyed. The city centre is badly damaged. The steelworks, the actual target, are less badly hit than the residential areas surrounding them. German bomber navigation is not precise enough to make the distinction. The people who live next to the furnaces pay the price. Sheffield rebuilds after 1945. The steelworks continue. For a brief post-war decade, the Don Valley hums again. The city invests in housing, vast council estates on the hills surrounding the city, replacing the worst of the back-to-back terraces. Park Hill, completed in 1961, is the most ambitious of these projects. A single interconnected deck-access housing development stretching across a hillside above the train station. 995 flats, 1,000 feet long, described by its architects as streets in the sky. It is one of the largest social housing projects in Europe. It wins architectural prizes. Its residents, moved from the slums of the valley below, initially love it. Park Hill's subsequent history is Sheffield's post-war history in miniature. Built to solve a problem, it creates a different problem. The lifts break, the heating fails, the maintenance budget is cut, the streets in the sky become corridors of isolation. By the 1980s, Park Hill is one of the most notorious addresses in Sheffield, a place associated with poverty and crime and despair, even though many of its residents build good lives within it against the odds. It is now a listed building. English Heritage gave it Grade 2 star listed status in 1998, making it the largest listed building in Europe. Urban Splash is redeveloping it. Some flats are being refurbished as private apartments. The external structure remains. The social housing that it was built to provide is being steadily replaced by market-rate accommodation. The debate about what this means goes on, but the real crisis comes earlier. The crisis comes in 1984. By the late 1970s, Sheffield's steel industry is already in serious trouble. The oil shocks of the 1970s raise energy costs. Foreign competition, particularly from Japan and from Korea, producing steel more cheaply and often more efficiently, bites into market share. The British Steel Corporation, nationalised in 1967, is losing money on a vast scale. The private steel firms are struggling equally. Then Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government takes power in 1979. Its diagnosis of Britain's economic problems is clear. The nationalised industries, the trade unions, the subsidised, uncompetitive legacy industries of the post-war settlement are the disease. The cure is exposure to market forces. If industries cannot survive without subsidy, they should not survive. For Sheffield, this means the steelworks. Between 1979 and 1984, steel employment in Sheffield falls by over 30,000 jobs. Not 30,000 workers redeployed or retrained. 30,000 jobs gone. Men in their 40s and 50s who have worked in the Don Valley their entire lives, whose fathers worked there, whose grandfathers worked there, told that the furnaces are closing and there is nothing for them. The skills that took a lifetime to acquire are no longer required. The community built around those skills, the pubs, the working men's clubs, the football grounds, the rhythms of shift work, and the social patterns it created, begins to dissolve. Then comes the miners' strike of 1984. The Sheffield coalfields in the surrounding South Yorkshire villages are part of the National Union of Mine Workers' Heartland. When Arthur Scargill calls the strike in March 1984 to resist pit closures, South Yorkshire comes out. The men from the Sheffield steelworks, many of them already laid off, stand with the miners. The solidarity is real, and it is old. Steel and coal are connected industries, connected communities, connected identities. The strike lasts a year. It is the most bitter industrial dispute in post-war British history. The police operations mounted against the striking miners and their supporters, the Battle of Orgreave in June 1984, when mounted police charged pickets at a coking plant a few miles east of Sheffield, produced scenes of violence on British soil that most people had thought belonged to a different country. Men are charged by horses on a road in South Yorkshire. Batons come down on skulls. The cameras are there. The images go around the world. Orgreave matters specifically to Sheffield because it is Sheffield's doorstep. The men on that road are Sheffield's neighbours, brothers, fathers. The Independent Police Complaints Commission investigation into Orgreave opened in 2012 and closed in 2016 without any prosecutions, concludes that there is evidence of serious police misconduct, but that the passage of time makes prosecution impossible. The South Yorkshire Police Force, the same force implicated in the Hillsborough cover-up 5 years later, is not held accountable at Orgreave. The campaign for a public inquiry continues, led by the families and former miners to this day. The strike ends in March 1985, defeat for the miners, with no concessions on pit closures. The closures proceed. The community structures built over a century around the coal and steel industries of South Yorkshire are dismantled over the following decade with a speed that is almost impossible to comprehend unless you lived through it. What does a city do when its reason for existing is removed? Sheffield spends the late 1980s and the 1990s in a condition that can only honestly be called grief. Not everyone calls it that. The politicians call it restructuring. The economists call it transition. The people who live in it call it something darker. Unemployment in Sheffield reaches 15% in the mid-1980s. In some Don Valley communities, it is closer to 30%. The physical landscape of the valley changes dramatically. The furnaces are demolished, the rolling mills are torn down, the vast brownfield sites are fenced off and left to grass over. The Don Valley that had been uninterrupted industrial operation for over a century becomes, almost overnight, a series of empty fields punctuated by derelict buildings. But Sheffield is, beneath everything, a city of makers. The making adapts. The cutlery trade that survived the steel revolution, that survived 2 world wars, does not entirely die. It shrinks dramatically. Cheap stainless steel from the Far East captures the mass market entirely by the 1970s. But at its high end, it persists. Craftspeople making handmade knives and scissors, continuing the tradition that Chaucer noted in the 1380s, still work in Sheffield today. The Hallamshire cutlery and silverware industry, the collective name for what remains, is tiny by Victorian standards, but it survives, and its products are among the finest of their kind, made anywhere in the world. The university sector grows. The University of Sheffield and Sheffield Hallam University together educate nearly 60,000 students today. The University of Sheffield, a red brick institution founded in 1905 from the amalgamation of earlier technical colleges, has produced 5 Nobel Prize winners. Hans Krebs, who fled Nazi Germany and arrived in Sheffield in 1935, discovers the Krebs cycle here, the biochemical process by which living cells produce energy from oxygen, one of the foundational discoveries of modern biology, for which he receives the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1953. Sheffield gives him the laboratory. Sheffield gives him the peace in which to think. In return, he gives the world a piece of knowledge so fundamental that every biology textbook on Earth now carries his name. Harry Brearley is born in Sheffield in 1871, the son of a steel melter. He leaves school at 12 to work in the steelworks. He educates himself at night school. He rises to become a research metallurgist at Brown Firth Laboratories in Sheffield. In 1913, experimenting with high chromium alloys for gun barrels, he notices that some of his experimental samples are not rusting. He investigates further. He has discovered, or rather is one of several people discovering simultaneously, what he calls rustless steel. The world will come to call it stainless steel. Brearley immediately sees the implications for cutlery, the traditional Sheffield trade that has always been plagued by the staining and rusting of iron and carbon steel blades. He contacts the Sheffield cutlery industry. They are initially not interested. They find the new steel difficult to work with their existing techniques. The innovation that should have transformed Sheffield's cutlery trade is first commercialized not in Sheffield, but in the United States, by companies who see its potential faster than the industry that sits above the man who found it. Sheffield eventually catches up. Stainless steel becomes central to the Don Valley's output. It goes into surgical instruments, into kitchen equipment, into aerospace components, into the nuclear industry. The innovation discovered in a Sheffield laboratory in 1913 is still, in 2026, the material basis of industries worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually worldwide. The city that could not always profit from its own inventions at least had the inventions. David Blunkett is born in Sheffield in 1947. Blind from birth, he grows up in the city, attends Sheffield schools, goes to Sheffield Polytechnic. He becomes a city councillor, then leader of Sheffield City Council in the early 1980s. The years of the steel closures, the years when the council is trying to hold together a city that is falling apart economically. He goes to Parliament as MP for Sheffield Brightside in 1987. He becomes Home Secretary in Tony Blair's government in 2001. He is one of the most powerful and controversial holders of that office in post-war history. Architect of major criminal justice reforms, forced to resign twice over personal matters. A figure who divides opinion sharply. What Blunkett represents in the story of Sheffield is the city's political tradition. Sheffield is a Labour city, deeply and continuously. It has not returned a Conservative MP since 1935. Its politics are shaped by the industrial working class that built it, by the trade union culture that organized that class, by the memory of the steel closures and Orgreave, and the betrayal, as Sheffield understands it, of the communities that built the industrial wealth of Britain. That political tradition is not uncomplicated. Sheffield City Council in the early 1980s, under David Blunkett, pursues a radical left agenda that includes declaring Sheffield a nuclear-free zone in 1980, one of the first local authorities in Britain to do so, and investing in public arts, in community development, in alternative economic strategies that sometimes work and sometimes don't, but always demonstrate that the city refuses to accept the terms of its own decline as fixed. The 1991 World Student Games come to Sheffield. The city builds the Don Valley Stadium, the Ponds Forge International Sports Centre, the Sheffield Arena. It goes significantly over budget. It is criticised at the time. Looking back, the infrastructure created for the Games becomes the physical foundation of Sheffield's sporting identity. The arena, rebranded as the Utilita Arena, is now one of the largest indoor venues in the country. Ponds Forge is still one of the best swimming facilities in the UK. The investment in sport becomes one of the few clear wins of the post-industrial transition. The 2000s and 2010s bring a cautious, uneven, genuinely partial regeneration. The lower Don Valley, the brownfield land where the great steelworks stood, is developed as a retail and light industrial zone. Meadowhall Shopping Centre, opened in 1990 on the site of a former steelworks, becomes one of the largest shopping centres in the UK and simultaneously one of the most argued over symbols of Sheffield's post-industrial reinvention. It brings jobs. It draws retail spending that might otherwise go to the city centre. It also drains retail spending from the city centre, contributing to the decline of the shops on Fargate and the Moor. Sheffield argues about Meadowhall the way cities argue about decisions that cannot be undone. The cultural industries emerge as a genuine economic force. Sheffield's music scene, always strong, rooted in the same working-class energy that produced the steel, becomes nationally significant. The Human League, formed in Sheffield in 1977, produced Don't You Want Me in 1981, the best-selling single in the UK that year. Pulp, formed by Jarvis Cocker in Sheffield in 1978. Cocker is a Sheffield boy, son of a local actor and television presenter, produced Common People in 1995, one of the most precisely observed songs about class in the English language. The song is about a certain kind of middle-class desire to experience poverty as aesthetic adventure. Cocker, who grew up poor in Sheffield and spent years on a Sheffield housing estate, writes it with the authority of someone who knows the difference between romanticizing poverty and living in it. Arctic Monkeys form in High Green, North Sheffield, in 2002. Their first album, Whatever People Say I Am, That's What I'm Not, released in 2006, becomes the fastest-selling debut album in British music history, a record previously held by Oasis. The album is a portrait of Sheffield nightlife, the takeaways and the clubs, and the taxi queues and the Saturday nights, so precise and so alive that it functions simultaneously as great pop music and as social documentation. Sheffield recognizes itself in it immediately. The rest of Britain recognizes something true about cities they have never been to. The Arctic Monkeys do for Sheffield in the 2000s, something like what Oasis did for Manchester in the 1990s. They make the city cool, not by pretending it is something it isn't, but by insisting, very loudly, that what it actually is deserves to be heard. Sheffield today is a city of 580,000 people in the city proper, over 1.4 million in the wider Sheffield city region. It is the greenest city in England, an official designation based on the fact that more than 60% of Sheffield's area is green space, the legacy of the hills and the parks, and the fact that the city grew up in a natural bowl between steep, wooded hillsides that could never be built on. There are more trees per person in Sheffield than in any other city in Europe. In a city that spent a century choking its rivers and poisoning its air, this is not irony. It is the result of decisions made over the post-war decades to take the green space seriously, to invest in the parks, to protect the hills. The Don Valley is still being transformed. Some of the old steelworks sites remain as brownfield land. Others have been developed into business parks, sports facilities, logistics centres. The Kelham Island district, the oldest industrial area of Sheffield, where forges and grinding wheels operated from the 12th century onward, has been regenerated into a creative and residential quarter. The Kelham Island Museum, housed in a 19th century generating station on the island in the Don, formed by a medieval mill race, is one of the best industrial museums in the country. The Bessemer converter that changed the world stands outside it, vast and orange-red, 40 feet tall. The rivers are cleaner. The Don has fish in it again. Salmon have returned to the sheaf for the first time in a century. The sky above the Don Valley is no longer permanently orange at night. Standing where the great furnaces of Browns or Vickers or Hadfields once stood, looking up, you can see stars. The cutlery tradition continues, small and precise and proud. On the back streets of the city centre, in workshops that visitors rarely find, craftspeople still make knives by the methods that Sheffield has refined over 7 centuries. The steel is different, better, purer, the product of discoveries made in this city's own laboratories. The hands that shape it are the same hands, in the sense that matters, skilled, patient, knowing. Sheffield has not solved the problems created by deindustrialization. The inequality is stark and persistent. Some of the former steel communities east of the city centre, Burngreave, Darnall, Firth Park, remain among the most deprived urban areas in England. The jobs that replaced the steelworks are real, but they are not the same jobs. A distribution warehouse does not create the same social fabric as a steelworks, however brutal that fabric sometimes was. The working men's clubs have mostly closed. The trade union branches are shadows of what they were. The solidarity that Sheffield is proud of, the solidarity of the strike, the solidarity of Orgreave, the solidarity of the mining villages, is harder to sustain when people are working alone, on 0-hours contracts, in warehouses on the edge of town. But Sheffield persists. It persists with a specific quality that the city seems to produce from its particular combination of hills and rivers and industrial memory. Not quite northern defiance, that is Manchester's quality, louder and more performative. Something quieter and harder. A refusal to be impressed by its own decline. An insistence on making things carefully and making them well, even when the market for careful, well-made things is not what it was. Harry Brearley discovers stainless steel, and the Sheffield cutlery industry initially ignores him. Hans Krebs flees the Nazis and arrives in Sheffield with nothing, and finds in its university the conditions to make one of the century's greatest discoveries. The Arctic Monkeys form in a council estate in North Sheffield and make the fastest-selling debut album in British history. The Don Valley steelworks are demolished, and the Don, slowly, gets its fish back. Sheffield has always made things that outlast the making of them. The knives are still sharp, the steel is still in the world's bridges and buildings and surgical wards. The cycle that Krebs traced is happening right now, in every cell of every living body on Earth. That is what Sheffield left behind when the furnaces went out. The sky above the valley is clear tonight, the hills are visible on every side. The 5 rivers are running, the way they have always run, cold and fast off the Peak District stone, finding their way down to the Don, finding their way to the sea. Thanks for watching. If this walk through Sheffield moved you, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Which city should we walk through next? We'll see you in the past.